In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to use standard terrains inside of View Extreme. Alright, so in View there are 4 different types of terrains. There's standard, procedural, infinite, and spherical. Now in this first lesson we're going to talk about how to use standard terrains, and then we'll follow up in these following lessons on how to use the last 3. Now standard terrains use what's called a fixed resolution. So whenever we load in a standard terrain, that's what its resolution is going to be. So the default resolution for a standard terrain should be 256 by 256. Now we can increase that resolution to get more detail out of our terrains. Now standard terrains are the most basic and fastest to render. Now their one major drawback that they have is the amount of detail is fixed because of that fixed resolution. So let's go ahead and create a standard terrain inside of our view. So to do that, we'll just simply left click on our double action icon for our standard height field terrain. And that's going to drop in our terrain here. Let's just back up in our view. And we'll do a quick render on this just to look at that. And you'll see here that we get a pretty good amount of detail for the distance of the camera here. But as we zoom in closer to this terrain here, and we render that, you'll see that that detail is diminished, and it's not as high resolution as we thought. Now, in order to increase resolution, what we need to do is right-click and load up a standard terrain, so we can bring up our options. So let's right-click on that standard height field terrain, and you'll see we have new terrain options. Now here we can determine the width and height of this terrain. Now normally I like to stay with a square power of 2 multiple on my width and height here. So I'm going to bump this up to, let's say, 2048 by 2048. Let's just go all out here. Let's hit OK on this, and it's going to bring up our terrain editor at first, but then we'll just hit OK and take a look at this inside of our scene. Now one thing that you'll notice is that this is much flatter, but another thing that you should notice is it's much larger than our original terrain. Now because we have this higher resolution, we can actually scale this down to that original size, and then we can also scale it up in just the Z direction just to give it a little bit more height. Now as we scale this up, let's zoom in and take a look at our detail. So it may not look like much right here, but if we go ahead and do a quick render, you'll see that we have a lot of detail in here. And this gives us a lot to sculpt with as well, whenever we go into our terrain editor. Now we can modify this resolution by going into the terrain editor, but this could cause some issues whenever increasing or decreasing that resolution. So to bring up our terrain editor, with the object selected, you can click on Edit Objects, or you could just double click on the terrain. Now inside of our terrain editor you can see just how much detail we have with this, and you'll also notice the current resolution of this terrain. Now I can multiply this, but I really don't want to go over the 2048 by 2048 because this is a fixed resolution, and it's putting all of this detail over the entire surface, and this could cause some instability. So if I go ahead and divide this, you'll notice that some of that detail dissipates. And if I divide it again, even more, and then we go down to the 256 by 256, it looks like for some reason it's not going down evenly, so that could be an issue there. Maybe I didn't type in the right number. But we look at this and we see just how much detail has been lost here. So let's hit OK. Let's do a quick render on this, and you can see how smooth this has gotten. Now let's take that detail back up. Let's go to divide by 2, and I typed in 2408, that's why it didn't come out right. So now we're at that 2048 by 2048. Now let's take a look at that detail. Let's render this out, and you'll see that that detail is nowhere near what it was whenever we first created the terrain. Alright, it's very pixelated, and it's just not there any longer. So we've really just destroyed that. So if you want to add resolution, it's always best to load up a brand new terrain. Alright, so let's get rid of that standard terrain. We've talked about how we can modify that resolution, but using high resolutions on a standard terrain really wastes a lot of processing power because it does apply that resolution to the entire terrain instead of only what we can actually see. So if I create a new standard terrain in here, my camera may not be able to see one side of the mountain, and if I look at my top view, I can only see this much of that terrain. And in a standard terrain, it's applying this entire resolution even behind the camera, and that's just wasted memory. So a way that we can get around this is using procedural terrains, and those are really going to come in handy for us. So we're going to learn about how to use those in our next lesson.